Sometimes you look at someone famous, really famous, like Elvis Presley, and you just wonder what made them tick. What was really going on behind those moves, that voice, that whole presence. It wasn't just music. It was something deeper, something that pulled people in and wouldn't let go. And it still does. He sold over 1 billion records, right? That's not just talent. That's a connection to something primal in us. Think about it. Here was a guy from Tupelo, Mississippi, who barely made it through high school. Then he exploded onto the scene in the mid 1950s. The way he moved, the way he sang, it shocked some people. It thrilled millions of others. What was that all about? Was it just sex appeal? Or was something else, something hidden, working its magic? Freud, he talked a lot about the hidden stuff, the unconscious mind. The drives and desires we don't even know we have, but they shape everything. What if we look at Elvis through that lens? What if we try to understand his stage presence, his performance style, not just as entertainment, but as a window into those deeper psychological currents? We're talking about a man whose hip swivels were literally censored on national television. The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, remember that? They only showed him from the waist up. Why? Because it was too much. Too raw. Too Freudian, maybe? And then there's the transformation. From the raw, rebellious kid to the sequined jumpsuit icon of Las Vegas. What did that evolution say about his inner world? And the way he died, too young, in 1977, after years of struggling with addiction and health issues. Does his performance style hold clues to that whole trajectory? People like Peter Guralnick, who wrote those amazing biographies, Last Train to Memphis and Careless Love, they give us the facts. They tell us the story. But Freud, he might give us a way to feel the story, to understand the emotional truth behind it. So let's just lay it all out. Let's see if we can peel back the layers of the king of rock and roll. Let's ask some tough questions about what was really going on when Elvis stepped onto that stage. What was he showing us, and what was he hiding, and what did it all mean for him and for us, his audience? Well, number 18, can a performer be a pure embodiment of the id? When Elvis first hit the stage, especially in the mid 1950s, it felt like something completely untamed had been let loose. Freud's idea of the id, the raw primal part of our psyche, really comes to mind here. The id for Freud is all about instinct, pleasure, and immediate gratification. It doesn't care about rules or consequences, it just wants what it wants, right now. And if you watched Elvis perform Hound Dog on Milton Berle's show in 1956, you saw the id in action. He wasn't just singing, he was physically enacting the song's energy, moving his hips, grinding his body in a way that was completely new and, for many, shocking. Critics and parents freaked out. The press called him Elvis the Pelvis. Ed Sullivan, a very conservative TV host, initially said he wouldn't have Elvis on his show because he was too vulgar. But then the ratings dictated otherwise. When Elvis finally appeared on Sullivan's show, he was famously filmed from the waist up to hide those obscene movements. This censorship itself highlights how much his performance tapped into something deeply unconscious and unsettling for the societal superego of the time. This wasn't planned choreography in the classical sense. It felt spontaneous, an urge bursting forth from deep within, guided by pure pleasure and impulse. It was about the beat, the rhythm, and the sheer joy of physical expression. Biographers often talk about Elvis's early life, his poverty, his strong connection to his mother, Gladys, and also his relative lack of formal education or discipline in many areas. This background might have allowed his id to remain less constrained than in others. Well, he wasn't trained in conventional showmanship, he just felt the music and moved. His early manager, Bob Neal, and then later Colonel Tom Parker, they just let him be. They recognized that raw, untamed energy was his greatest asset. It wasn't something to be polished out, but something to be amplified. The way he would fall to his knees, sweat pouring, eyes closed, lost in the moment. That was the id demanding its pleasure, totally oblivious to external judgment. It's the unadulterated desire, the pure, unthinking pursuit of satisfaction made visible in his body. And this raw, uninhibited display connected with millions, teenagers especially. They felt that same surge of rebellious energy, that desire to break free from strictures. They saw their own emerging id reflected in his gyrations. It was a release, a permission to feel things, to move in ways that society often told them were wrong. The sheer number of fainting girls at his concerts, the screaming and crying, was an almost cathartic experience. It wasn't just appreciation for music, it was a collective eruption of suppressed desires. That pure, unfiltered passion on stage, that's what Freud was talking about with the id. And what about the price of that pure id expression? Did it burn him out? Did it set a precedent for a life lived on impulse? Was there a deeper hunger that could never truly be satisfied by external adoration? Number 17 was the ego always in control of the king's persona. Elvis Presley's career shows a clear progression from raw instinct to a highly managed persona. If the ED was king in his early days, his ego certainly took the throne later, albeit with ongoing struggles. The ego, in Freudian terms, is the realistic part that mediates between the id's desires and the superego's moral strictures, all while dealing with external reality. Elvis, as he grew into a global phenomenon, had to develop a powerful ego to navigate the demands of fame, the music industry, and public scrutiny. He learned to control his image, to refine his stagecraft, to present a polished version of himself. Consider his transition from the shocking rebel of 1956 to the universally loved G.I. Elvis of 1958. His draft into the army was a huge moment. It was a move that solidified his good boy image, satisfying the superego of a nation. During this time, his ego was working overtime. He cut his iconic hair, followed military orders, and was photographed shaking hands with officers. He became a symbol of American virtue, even visiting his mother's gravesite in uniform, a photo that circulated widely, emphasizing his filial piety. This wasn't the spontaneous ide of his early performances. This was a calculated, or at least a highly adaptive, ego response to maintain his career and reputation amidst criticism. He even famously turned down special treatment during his service, choosing to be a regular soldier, which further cemented his public image. Later in his Hollywood years, roughly from 1960 to 1968, his ego was largely channeled into constructing a carefully curated, wholesome film star persona. The wild movements were tamed, the rebellious edge softened. He played likable, often romantic leads in films like G.I. Blues or Blue Hawaii. This period, while commercially successful, often felt constrained. The raw energy of the id was still there, perhaps bubbling beneath the surface, but his ego, guided by Colonel Parker's meticulous management and the demands of Hollywood studios, kept it under wraps. The purpose was to expand his audience, to make him palatable to families, to ensure longevity. It was a conscious effort to fit into a predefined mold to ensure continued success, even if it meant sacrificing some of his artistic soul. The 68 comeback special showed a fascinating struggle between the ego and the returning id. Dressed in black leather, performing in an intimate setting, Elvis looked and sounded like he had found his edge again. It was a deliberate attempt to reclaim his rock and roll roots. This was the ego saying, I can still be that guy, but I'm doing it on my own terms now. He was still controlling the narrative, still presenting a polished show, but the choice of material and the intensity of his performance hinted at a deeper, more authentic self breaking through the Hollywood facade. It was a powerful demonstration of the ego's ability to adapt and even revitalize a persona, drawing on deeper energies when necessary. But how much of that return was a conscious choice of self-expression, and how much was a cleverly engineered spectacle? Did the ego always truly choose the path, or was it just constantly reacting to external pressures and the id's persistent murmurings? Number 16, did the superego's I shape Elvis's evolution? The superego, in Freudian theory, acts as our moral compass and conscience. It's the internalized voice of parents, teachers, and society telling us what's right and wrong, what's acceptable and unacceptable. For Elvis, a public figure operating under intense scrutiny, the superego of American society played a massive role in shaping his performance style and career trajectory. His journey from rebellious youth to respectable icon and then to a more isolated, grandiose figure can be read as a constant negotiation with this internalized societal judgment. When Elvis first appeared on television, the outrage from conservative groups, religious leaders, and parents was immediate and vocal. Newspaper editorials condemned his lewd movements. The National Association of Evangelicals called his music barbaric. This was society's superego in full force, trying to put boundaries around what it perceived as a dangerous sexual energy. And Elvis, through his management, responded. After the Milton Berle show outcry, he toned down his movements on subsequent appearances, including his famous waist-up performance on Ed Sullivan. This was the ego bowing to the superego's demands. trying to appease and conform, even if it meant suppressing the raw id for a time. His draft into the army in 1958 was a pivotal moment in this superego narrative. He wasn't dodging the draft, unlike some other celebrities. He served his country. This act was widely praised. It was the ultimate demonstration of conformity to societal expectations, transforming him from a menace to a model citizen. The superego had demanded a sacrifice, and Elvis delivered. It solidified his image as an American hero, and this allowed his career to continue, opening doors to Hollywood and broader acceptance. This period, the early 1960s, saw him making family-friendly movies and singing more wholesome songs. His stage presence became less overtly sexual and more charming, less dangerous. The superego had largely won, forcing his performance into a safer, more palatable box. However, the superego's influence wasn't just external. Elvis himself was a deeply religious man, raised in a conservative Southern environment. He carried an internal superego shaped by his upbringing, a sense of guilt or duty that often clashed with his more hedonistic impulses. Peter Guralnick's biographies detail his constant struggle with morality. His generous giving contrasted with his extravagant lifestyle, his desire for spiritual peace alongside his indulgences. This internal conflict surely manifested in his performance. The good boy image he cultivated, the polite, "thank you very much," after a sexually charged performance, was a way to appease both the external and internal superego. By the 1970s, as his health declined and his personal life became more turbulent, his performances in Las Vegas sometimes showed a strange combination of continued spectacle and underlying sadness. The flashy jumpsuits, the dramatic gestures, the self-mocking humor, these could be seen as a final, desperate attempt of the ego to manage the public persona under the weight of an increasingly demanding and critical internal superego battling with the id's urges for escape and pleasure. The superego's constant pressure to maintain his king status, to always deliver, might have contributed to his eventual burnout. Did the superego's relentless pressure, both external and internal, ultimately limit his artistic expression and contribute to his later struggles? How much of his performance was truly his own, and how much was a carefully crafted response to what he thought society expected? Number 15, was his pelvic thrust a pure phallic statement? Let's talk about the famous pelvic thrust. It was the move that defined early Elvis and caused the biggest stir. From a Freudian perspective, this gesture screams phallic symbolism. The phallic stage, typically occurring around ages 3 to 6, is where a child's focus shifts to their genitals and they start exploring gender identity and sexual difference. While this stage is about early development, its echoes reverberate throughout adult life, especially in expressions of power, sexuality, and desire. Elvis's stage presence, particularly his signature hip movements, became a potent, undeniable symbol of masculine sexual power. When Elvis first appeared, America was still very conservative, especially regarding public displays of sexuality. His gyrations weren't subtle, they were direct, unapologetic, and highly suggestive. He wasn't just shaking his hips, he was thrusting them, often with a microphone held provocatively, almost as an extension of his body. This wasn't merely dancing, it was a visceral, undeniable assertion of male sexuality, an embodiment of raw, untamed virility. The term Elvis the Pelvis, coined by the media, explicitly linked his identity to his pelvis, making the phallic symbolism unavoidable. This wasn't just about entertainment, it was about presenting a powerful, almost threatening, masculine sexual energy to a mass audience. Cultural critics and psychoanalysts have often pointed to the phallic nature of the microphone in performance. When Elvis held the microphone, not just to sing, but to gesture with it, to swing it, to caress it, he was, on an unconscious level, amplifying his own phallic presence. It became an extension of his power, both vocal and sexual. In his film performances like Jailhouse Rock, his dance numbers are full of these suggestive, almost aggressive movements that leave little doubt about their underlying sexual charge. It was an unfiltered expression of male potency, a challenge to the era's repression of sexuality. This wasn't just about his own individual expression, it resonated deeply with his audience. For young women, it was an exciting, almost forbidden arousal. He represented a breaking free from the polite, sanitized images of masculinity. For young men, he offered a blueprint for rebellious, confident sexuality. The phallic display became a symbol of defiance against societal norms, a statement that sexuality was powerful, natural, and not something to be hidden. It was an affirmation of a very basic, fundamental aspect of human desire. Later in his career, especially in the Las Vegas years, the thrusts were still there, but they became more stylized, more of a deliberate part of the show, a nod to his past rather than a spontaneous eruption. The jumpsuits, tight and emphasizing his physique, continued to highlight his body, maintaining that phallic emphasis even as the movements became less frenetic. It's as if the symbol became an institution, still powerful, but perhaps less urgently felt. The phallic signifier was now a known quantity, a part of the brand, rather than a raw, shocking discovery. But did this constant emphasis on his phallic power make it harder for him to connect on other levels? Did he feel trapped by the very symbol he created? And what does it say about a culture that both reviles and craves such raw sexual display? Number 14. What did the lip curl really mean? Elvis's famous lip curl, that sneering, confident snarl, is another iconic element of his stage presence. From a Freudian perspective, this gesture can be deeply tied to oral fixation. The oral stage is the earliest stage of psychosexual development, centered around the mouth and the pleasure derived from sucking, biting, and eating. If an individual experiences either too much or too little gratification during this stage, they might develop an oral fixation, leading to adult traits like excessive eating, smoking, nail biting, or certain verbal behaviors. While Elvis's lip curl wasn't a direct oral gratification like eating, it was a profound oral expression that carried significant psychological weight. The lip curl was more than just a facial tic. It was a statement. It combined sex appeal with a hint of danger, a challenge, and an undeniable confidence. It wasn't a full smile, which would be an open invitation. Instead, it was a half smile, a slight lift of the upper lip that suggested a hint of disdain, a touch of rebellion, and an underlying sensuality. It was playful, but also slightly aggressive. It drew attention to his mouth, a primary zone of pleasure and expression. And it highlighted his lips, which were often seen as full and sensual. This focus on the mouth, its shape, its subtle movements can be interpreted as a lingering emphasis from the oral stage. Consider how the lip curl often accompanied his singing, especially during powerful vocal moments or pauses. It was a punctuation mark, an exclamation. It amplified the raw emotion in his voice, adding a visual layer to his vocal performance. It made him look a little wild, a little untamed, reminiscent of an animal ready to pounce or snarl. This animalistic quality, untamed and instinctual, further links it to those primal, oral stage desires. It's a non-verbal communication that bypasses the rational, speaking directly to the unconscious. Biographically, Elvis did exhibit other oral fixated behaviors throughout his life. His notorious struggles with eating, especially later in his career, and his heavy reliance on pills, which are ingested orally, can be seen as manifestations of an underlying oral fixation. Elaine Dundee's book, Elvis and Gladys, talks about his close relationship with his mother, which included a strong dependency. This intense early bond, a core element of the oral stage's development, might have contributed to these lasting oral traits. The lip curl on stage then becomes a public, performative expression of this deeply rooted internal dynamic. The curl also served as a subtle gesture of control and superiority. It was a look that said, "I know something you don't," or "I'm in charge here." It was cool, detached, but utterly captivating. For the audience, it was intoxicating. It made him seem untouchable, yet utterly desirable. It added to his mystique a nonverbal communication that suggested a depth of character and a confidence that went beyond words. It wasn't just a physical tic, it was a psychological marker, a signifier of an inner world constantly seeking expression, even in the most subtle of gestures. What would Elvis's performances have been like without that lip curl? Would he have possessed the same enigmatic power? And did that subtle snarl offer him a moment of genuine self-expression that his more choreographed movements sometimes lacked? Number 13, was there an anal retention in his later stagecraft? Freud's anal stage, typically following the oral stage, is centered on bowel control and the associated feelings of independence, control, and mastery. Fixations at this stage can lead to anal retentive traits, excessive orderliness, rigidity, stubbornness, and a need for control, or anal expulsive traits, sloppiness, recklessness. While Elvis was certainly not anal retentive in a literal sense with his stage presence, there's an interesting argument to be made about how a need for control, order, and ritual began to manifest in his later performance style, especially compared to his early explosive spontaneity. In his early career, Elvis's movements were fluid, chaotic, and unpredictable. He seemed to lose himself in the music, But by the 1970s, particularly during his Las Vegas residencies, his stage presence became much more structured, almost ritualistic. His performances were highly choreographed from his entrance to his bowing. The movements, while still powerful, were less spontaneous and more precise, almost mechanical at times. This shift towards a highly controlled, almost rigid performance can be seen as a manifestation of anal retentive tendencies, a need for order and predictability. Consider the elaborate costumes of the 1970s, the dazzling jumpsuits often adorned with sequins, studs, and heavy embroidery. These suits were not just flashy, they were meticulously designed, often tight-fitting, presenting a contained, almost armored image. They suggested an attempt to control the physical body, to present a perfect, unblemished facade. This contrasted sharply with the more casual, disheveled look of his early years. The precision of the costumes, the way he would often adjust them during a performance, hints at a meticulousness, a need for everything to be just so. This hyper-attention to detail and appearance can be linked to the anal retentive desire for perfection and order. His interaction with the audience also became more ritualized. The scarf throwing, the handshaking, the perfectly timed bows, these were all part of a carefully constructed routine. There was a predictability to it, a sense of, everything being in its proper place. While these actions were designed to connect with the audience, they also served to create a predictable boundary, a sense of control over the chaotic energy of a live show. It was as if he needed to contain the experience to present it in an orderly fashion rather than letting it spiral into the raw, unadulterated passion of his earlier days. Biographically, Elvis struggled with control in other areas of his life, especially as his fame grew. He had a meticulous approach to his personal environment, his cars, his Graceland estate, often demanding specific arrangements and routines from his entourage, the Memphis Mafia. This personal need for order and control, which can be linked to anal fixation, likely seeped into his professional performance. The energy that was once explosively expulsive in his youth now seemed to be contained, channeled, and carefully released within a highly structured framework. The wildness was still there, but it was now a controlled wildness, a spectacle of precision rather than raw abandon. Could this overemphasis on control on stage have been a way to compensate for a growing lack of control in his personal life? The rigidity of his performances reflect an internal battle against the chaos he felt around him. At number 12, how did libido fuel every sway and shout? Libido, for Freud, is the psychic energy or drive associated with instinctual desires, particularly sexual ones, but also encompassing life-affirming urges like creativity and self-preservation. When we talk about Elvis Presley's stage presence, it's impossible to ignore the sheer, overwhelming force of his libido. It wasn't just his movements, it was in his voice, his gaze, the way he held himself, the very air he generated. His entire performance was an outpouring of this fundamental life energy, channeled into music and spectacle. From the moment he stepped onto a stage, Elvis exuded an undeniable sexual charisma. His voice, a potent blend of blues, gospel, and country, had a raw, sensual quality that was inherently libidinous. It wasn't just about singing notes, it was about conveying emotion, desire, and passion. When he sang a slow ballad, his voice would caress the words, full of longing. When he rocked out, it was an explosion of guttural energy. This vocal expressiveness, so rich and varied, was a direct manifestation of his internal drives. Critics, like Grail Marcus in Mystery Train, often discuss his voice as a primal force, a voice that seemed to bypass intellect and go straight for the gut, or more accurately, the groin. And then there were the movements, the hip gyrations, the leg shaking, the lip curling. Every single one of these actions was imbued with a sexual charge. He wasn't just performing songs, he was performing desire. For his female fans especially, this was revolutionary. He validated their own burgeoning sexuality, making it okay, even exciting, to feel those urges. The screams, the fainting spells, the intense emotional reactions from his audience were not just about musical appreciation, they were a collective, almost primal, response to the unleashed libido he presented. It was a release, a communion of shared, often repressed sexual energy. This libidinous energy was also channeled into his creative drive. Freud believed that much of our creative output comes from sublimated sexual energy. Elvis's relentless work ethic in his early years, his passion for music, his constant touring and recording, like these can all be seen as a channeling of his vast internal energy. He lived and breathed performance, and his dedication was fueled by an insatiable drive to connect, to express, to be seen and adored. His very existence on stage was an affirmation of life, of vitality, of being fully present and alive. Even his appearance, the iconic hair, the clothing, contributed to this libidinous presence. He cultivated an image that was masculine, rebellious, and undeniably attractive. His looks became synonymous with a certain kind of raw, sensual beauty. The tight pants, the open shirts, the slicked back hair, these were not accidental. They were part of a deliberate presentation of a body charged with energy, a vessel for the overflowing libido. The stage became a conduit for this energy, amplifying it, projecting it outwards to envelop the entire audience in its magnetic pull. But was this relentless output of libido sustainable? Did it eventually deplete him, leaving him hollow when the stage lights dimmed? And did the constant demand for this sexual energy eventually lead to a more desperate, almost forced performance of it later in his career? Number 11, was his performance a grand act of sublimation? Sublimation, in Freudian theory, is a mature defense mechanism where socially unacceptable impulses or urges are transformed into more acceptable forms. For instance, aggressive impulses might be sublimated into competitive sports or sexual desires into artistic creation. For Elvis Presley, his entire stage presence and performance style can be seen as a profound, lifelong act of sublimation. He took his deep-seated psychological conflicts, his anxieties, his raw sexual energy, and his desire for acceptance, and channeled them into a captivating, culturally significant art form. Think about his humble beginnings in Tupelo, Mississippi, and later Memphis. He grew up poor, experienced the death of his twin brother, Jesse Garin, at birth, and was extremely close to his mother, Gladys. These early experiences, which psychoanalysts like Ernst Jones Freud's biographer and colleague would argue shape an individual's entire psychic structure, certainly provided a rich ground for internal conflict. The intensity of his bond with his mother, for example, is often cited. How does one express such complex, often unconscious emotional ties and desires in a conventional world? Through art, through performance often. His rebellious image, his hip movements, the raw power of his voice, these were initially seen as primitive or vulgar by many. But what if they were a sublimated expression of frustrations, anxieties, or even a sense of powerlessness from his youth? The sexual energy, too, instead of being acted out in ways that might be socially condemned, was channeled into an electrifying, though still controversial, performance. He didn't just sing songs, he became the songs, pouring his entire being into them. This intense engagement allowed him to safely express desires and emotions that might otherwise have been deemed inappropriate or too volatile. The creative process itself is often considered a prime example of sublimation. Elvis's tireless dedication to perfecting his craft, his endless hours spent rehearsing, his profound connection to music, these were all ways of channeling his internal energy. He found a socially acceptable, indeed celebrated, outlet for his powerful id impulses. Instead of destructive aggression, he gave us rock and roll. Instead of raw, unmediated sexual display, he gave us tantalizing, suggestive performance. His 68 comeback special is a powerful illustration. After years in Hollywood making often bland films, he returned to the stage with renewed vigor, almost as if he was sublimating his frustration with his movie career into an explosive musical performance, proving his artistic legitimacy once again. His generous nature, his philanthropy, his desire to please and connect with people, these two can be seen as sublimations of deeper needs for love and acceptance. He wanted to be loved, not just adored, and his performance was his most effective way of achieving that profound connection. He took the emotional intensity of his inner life, the loneliness, the vulnerability, the passion, and transformed it into a shared experience, making it palatable and beautiful for millions. But what happens when the well of internal conflict runs dry, or when the sublimation mechanism starts to falter? Did the later commercialization of his image dilute the raw power of his sublimation? Could the decline in his later performances be linked to a weakening of this defense mechanism, allowing the underlying impulses to emerge in less constructive ways? Number 10 was repression, his true performance partner. Repression, a core Freudian defense mechanism, involves pushing unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or memories into the unconscious mind, where they are no longer consciously accessible. For someone as iconic and often contradictory as Elvis Presley, we can certainly examine how repression might have operated both in his personal life and consequently in his carefully constructed stage presence. What was he not showing us, and how did that absence, that suppressed material shape what he did present? Elvis was famous for being polite, humble, and deeply respectful of his elders, especially his mother. Yet, on stage, he was a sexual provocateur, a rebel. This dichotomy suggests a strong element of repression at play. The good boy image he maintained off stage, and often even during his performances with his famous "thank you very much" and bowing, could be seen as a reaction formation, but also as a repression of the wilder, more transgressive aspects of his personality that found an outlet only in performance. The very act of containing these impulses in daily life meant they would often erupt with greater force when given a sanctioned space like the stage. His sexual presentation, while overt, also had elements of repression. He was tantalizing, suggestive, but rarely explicit. He hinted at sex, he promised sex, but he didn't fully deliver it in an aggressive, in-your-face manner. This carefully calibrated sexual energy could be seen as repression. In action, the ED's desires are acknowledged, but they are not fully unleashed. Instead, they are channeled into a captivating, but ultimately controlled, display. He offered an experience of forbidden pleasure without actually breaking certain societal taboos, at least not overtly. The fact that his movements were censored highlights this point. Society knew what he was implying, and the implication itself was enough to warrant repression from external forces. Later in his career, as his personal struggles with weight, medication, and isolation grew, his stage presence sometimes became an elaborate facade. He was the king, powerful and flawless, but behind the sequin jumpsuit and the practice moves, there was a man grappling with serious issues. The performance became a grand act of repression, an attempt to hide the inner turmoil, the vulnerability, the pain. He had to embody the myth of Elvis, even when his personal reality was crumbling. This required an enormous amount of psychic energy dedicated to keeping the real Elvis, the suffering Elvis, out of the public eye, and perhaps even out of his own conscious awareness during performances. Biographers like Peter Guralnick detail Elvis's profound loneliness and his struggles with identity, particularly after his mother's death. These painful emotions were often kept private, discussed only with a very close circle. On stage, however, he was gregarious, charismatic, and powerful. The stage became a sanctuary where the repressed anxieties and sadness could be momentarily forgotten, or perhaps transformed into the dramatic, emotional performances of his gospel songs or powerful ballads. It was a space where the repressed could be kept at bay, allowing the heroic, joyful persona to shine. Did the constant act of repressing his true self, particularly his vulnerabilities and anxieties, contribute to his eventual breakdown? What unseen forces were at play in the space between the dazzling performer and the struggling man? And how much of his magnetism stemmed from the very things he unconsciously kept hidden from us? Number 9, did castration anxiety haunt his post-army career? Castration anxiety, in Freudian terms, is the fear of losing one's penis for males, often symbolic of a broader fear of losing power, potency, or identity. While a literal fear of castration is usually rooted in childhood, its symbolic manifestations can be profound in adult life, especially for men whose identity is deeply intertwined with their masculinity, power, and sexual appeal. For Elvis Presley, especially after his army service and during his Hollywood years, one could argue that a symbolic castration anxiety influenced his stage presence and career choices as he moved away from his earlier raw, powerful image. When Elvis returned from the army in 1960, much had changed. He was no longer the dangerous rebel. He was a hero, a symbol of American decency. But this decency came at a cost. His music became softer, his movies wholesome, and his stage presence, initially, was almost non-existent. He stopped touring for many years, focusing on films that presented a sanitized version of his masculinity. The raw, phallic energy of his early public thrusts was largely absent or heavily diluted in his films. This shift could be interpreted as a symbolic castration, a taming of his wild, potent sexuality to fit a more acceptable, less threatening mold. He lost some of his edge, his dangerous allure. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, played a significant role in this transformation. Parker meticulously controlled Elvis's image, making decisions that prioritize commercial success over artistic expression or rebellious authenticity. This control could be seen as an external force imposing a form of symbolic castration, diminishing Elvis's creative autonomy and his raw, untamed power. He was told what to sing, what movies to make, how to act. This loss of creative control, often a source of great frustration for Elvis himself, directly impacted his stage presence when he eventually returned to live performances. The spontaneity was gone, replaced by a more disciplined, often rigid, presentation. The decline of his early rebellious image, the shift from active, dangerous sexuality to a more passive, romantic lead in films could also fuel this anxiety. His identity was so bound up in being Elvis the Pelvis, the embodiment of youthful, untamed masculine power. When that image was consciously suppressed, it might have led to an unconscious fear of losing his core identity, his potency as a performer and a man. The carefully constructed personas in his movies often featured him as a charming but ultimately harmless, romantic lead, a far cry from the raw energy that had made him famous. The '68 comeback special was a powerful, if temporary, reassertion of his potency. Dressed in black leather, he reclaimed his rock and roll roots, seemingly shedding the astrated film persona. It was a powerful act of defiance, a symbolic reclaiming of his power. However, even this comeback eventually led to the highly structured, almost operatic Las Vegas shows, with their elaborate costumes and predictable routines. While still powerful, these performances often lacked the dangerous, unpredictable edge of his youth. The fear of failure, of losing his king status, of not living up to his legend, became a palpable pressure. This constant need to prove himself, to maintain his iconic status, can be seen as a manifestation of a lingering anxiety about his potency and relevance. Did the pressure to conform and grow up actually diminish his core power? Was his later reliance on an almost exaggerated regal persona a defense against feeling symbolically castrated? And what unexpressed anxieties did he carry about his own masculinity as his body and career changed? Number 8 was Elvis trapped in a narcissistic echo chamber. Narcissism in Freudian psychology refers to an excessive preoccupation with oneself, one's physical appearance, or one's own needs and desires. While a certain degree of self-love is healthy, pathological narcissism can lead to a lack of empathy and an inflated sense of self-importance. For Elvis Presley, whose entire life was lived under the intense gaze of millions, his stage presence and performance style became a potent canvas for exploring and perhaps getting trapped within a narcissistic echo chamber. From his early days, Elvis cultivated a striking image: the meticulously styled hair, the dramatic clothes, the iconic sneer. This was not just about fashion, it was about presenting an idealized self. The sheer pleasure he seemed to derive from being watched, from being adored, from being the center of attention, speaks to a powerful narcissistic core. On stage, every movement, every pose was designed to captivate and draw focus. He was keenly aware of his effect on the audience, and he reveled in it. This feedback looped his performance, eliciting adoration, which then fueled more grandiose performance, created a powerful narcissistic circuit. Consider his later career in Las Vegas. The elaborate jumpsuits, often sparkling with thousands of jewels, were more than just costumes, they were extensions of a grandiose self-image. They were regal, almost god-like, signifying his status as the king. This external display of grandeur often accompanies narcissistic tendencies. His performances in the 1970s, while still powerful vocally, became more theatrical, almost a pageant dedicated to the cult of Elvis. He would command the stage, often in dramatic poses, basking in the cheers and screams of the audience. The entire spectacle became a mirror, reflecting his idealized self back to him. Biographically, Elvis was surrounded by an entourage, the Memphis Mafia, who often reinforced his idealized self. They were there to cater to his every whim, protecting him from external criticism and often from reality itself. This kind of environment can exacerbate narcissistic traits, making it difficult for an individual to develop a healthy sense of self that isn't dependent on external validation. His generous gifting of cars and houses, while seemingly altruistic, could also be seen as a way of maintaining this idealized image, a performance of beneficence. Freud also discussed the concept of the ego ideal, an internalized image of what one aspires to be. For Elvis, the king became his ego ideal, and his performances were a constant attempt to embody and present this idealized self. The constant pressure to live up to this image, to always be Elvis, meant that his stage presence was not just about expressing genuine emotion, but also about maintaining a perfect, flawless facade. This need for perfection, for constant adoration, points to a fragile self-esteem beneath the grandiosity. The applause wasn't just for his music, it was for validating his very existence. But what happens when the mirror stops reflecting perfectly, or when the adoration isn't enough to fill the void? Did the very mechanisms that created the king ultimately isolate him and contribute to his internal struggles? And was his addiction a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of control and grandiosity when reality became too much to bear? Number 7. How did he weaponize the uncanny? The uncanny, das Unheimliche in German, is a Freudian concept describing something that is both familiar and alien, something that ought to have remained hidden but has come to light. It evokes a feeling of disquiet, a strange mixture of comfort and dread. Elvis Presley, particularly in his early performances and again in his dramatic comeback, tapped into the uncanny in a powerful and almost weaponized way, using it to disrupt and captivate his audiences. In the mid-1950s, Elvis was familiar enough. He looked like a regular young man singing popular music genres, country, blues, gospel, that were already part of the American landscape. But his delivery, his movements, his intensity were utterly alien. They were both recognizable and shockingly new. He sang about love and heartbreak, but with a raw, almost guttural passion that felt both deeply human and strangely animalistic. The combination of the familiar sound of a ballad with the suggestive, almost violent, thrusts of his hips created a profoundly uncanny experience for many viewers. It was something they knew, but delivered in a way that felt wrong, transgressive, and deeply unsettling, yet undeniably alluring. Think about the way he sometimes seemed to lose himself in the music, his eyes closed, his body convulsing. It was as if something primal, something normally hidden, was being unleashed. This letting go, this surrender to instinct, was both familiar. We all had these instincts, and alien, we usually keep them suppressed. This public display of the unheimlich, the unhomely or the UN private, in a mass media context was part of his revolutionary appeal. He brought the unconscious desires and energies of a repressed society out into the open, making them visible and audible, and therefore uncannily present. The concept of the doppelganger also ties into the uncanny. As Elvis became a global phenomenon, the sheer number of impersonators, tribute artists, and cultural facsimiles multiplied. This proliferation of other Elvises could create an uncanny effect. When you see an Elvis impersonator, it's familiar, it's Elvis, but also unsettling, it's not him. And even Elvis himself, particularly in his later years, could embody an uncanny feeling. The pristine, almost doll-like image of his early fame morphed into the larger-than-life, often weary figure in the sequin jumpsuits. He was still Elvis, but sometimes a strangely altered, almost ghost-like version of his former self. The King had become a living monument, a familiar figure that also felt strangely distant and artificial, evoking a sense of mournful nostalgia mixed with unease. His 68 comeback special was a deliberate re-engagement with the uncanny. After years of making bland movies, he returned to a raw, stripped-down setting clad in black leather. He was the Elvis everyone knew, but a tougher, more experienced, more intense version. It was a familiar ghost returning, reminding everyone of the raw power that had been hidden away. This sudden reappearance of the old Elvis, almost like a return of the repressed, had a powerfully uncanny impact, thrilling fans and cementing his legend anew. Did Elvis consciously tap into this uncanny effect, or was it an accidental byproduct of his raw appeal? How much of his discomfort with his later image was related to an internal sense of becoming a stranger to himself? And what does it say about us that we are so drawn to performers who reveal our own hidden, unsettling desires? Number 6 was his good boy act, a reaction formation. A reaction formation is a Freudian defense mechanism where unacceptable impulses or feelings are unconsciously converted into their opposites. If someone harbors aggressive feelings, they might express exaggerated kindness. For Elvis Presley, whose stage presence was a potent mix of raw sexuality and profound politeness, his good boy demeanor can be strongly interpreted as a reaction formation against the rebellious and sexually charged energy he embodied. On one hand, Elvis was the epitome of danger and rebellion. His hip gyrations, his snarling lip, his tight clothes, these were all transgressive symbols in the conservative 1950s. He was denounced by religious leaders and family values advocates. He was labeled the devil's music. This was the idea in full display, challenging social norms and stirring up forbidden desires. On the other hand, offstage and even during performances, Elvis maintained an almost exaggerated sense of Southern politeness, deference, and respectability. He often said thank you very much after a song. He spoke softly in interviews. He always maintained he was just a regular country boy. He was famously respectful of his elders, particularly his mother Gladys and his fans. This wasn't just good manners, it was a deeply ingrained part of his persona. His stark contrast between his wild stage persona and his polite, almost deferential personal demeanor is a classic example of reaction formation. The unconscious impulse rebelliousness, sexual aggression is transformed into its opposite humility, respect, politeness to make it acceptable both to himself and to society. This dynamic was particularly evident in his early career when the public outcry against his performances was at its peak. While his body was thrusting provocatively, his facial expressions or verbal interjections would often be meek or charming. This allowed him to offer something shocking while simultaneously reassuring his audience and himself that he wasn't really a bad boy. It was a psychological balancing act. The good boy image served to mitigate the perceived threat of his raw sexual energy, making him more palatable to a wider audience and perhaps more acceptable to his own internal superego shaped by a religious upbringing. His military service in 1958 was a huge public act of reaction formation. By serving his country honorably, he publicly refuted the image of a delinquent and instead embraced the image of a patriotic, disciplined young man. This transformation was crucial in securing his mainstream acceptance and allowing him to transition into a successful film career, where he often played clean-cut, romantic leads. The wildness was repressed, and its opposite, wholesomeness, was put on full display. Even in his later Las Vegas years, when his performances were grand and often highly theatrical, he would still employ moments of charm, humor, and self-deprecation. He would often joke about his past controversies or his own larger-than-life status, subtly deflecting the intensity and the underlying sense of personal struggle. These moments of humble politeness could be seen as a consistent, lifelong defense mechanism, a way to manage the overwhelming, often contradictory pressures of his fame and his own internal conflicts. Did this constant internal struggle between the wild self and the good boy self exhaust him? Was the good boy image a cage that he struggled to break free from, even on stage? And what unspoken desires might have remained hidden behind that polite "thank you very much"? Number 5. How did symbolism permeate his every look and gesture? Freud understood that the unconscious mind communicates through symbols, often in dreams, but also in waking life, art, and behavior. For Elvis Presley, his entire stage presence, from his iconic hair to his elaborate costumes and signature movements, was saturated with powerful symbols that resonated deeply with his audience on an unconscious level. These symbols weren't just aesthetic choices, they were rich with meaning, reflecting his inner world and tapping into collective desires. Let's start with the hair. The famous pompadour, slicked back and often jet black, was more than a hairstyle. It was a symbol of rebellion, a deviation from the clean-cut norms of the 1950s. It suggested a certain wildness, an untamed quality, yet it was meticulously styled, indicating a careful attention to image. This duality, wildness contained by artistry, was symbolic of Elvis himself, raw energy channeled through performance. It was a crown, an assertion of his unique identity. When he was forced to cut it for the army, it was seen as a symbolic emasculation, a taming of the wild beast. The hair was his power. Then there are the clothes. In his early years, the pink and black outfits, the tailored suits, often with a hint of glitter, symbolized a breaking away from traditional working-class attire, but also from mainstream conformity. They were glamorous, individualistic, a statement of defiance and ambition. Later, the jumpsuits of the 1970s became perhaps his most potent symbolic attire. These were not just clothes, they were regal robes, a king's uniform, adorned with jewels and often featuring high collars and capes. They symbolized his status as the king, his almost god-like presence on stage. But they also hinted at a kind of armor, a protective layer, against the vulnerability he felt off stage. They were both magnificent and isolating, signifying his unique, almost mythical status. His movements were also symbolic. The pelvic thrust, as discussed, was a clear phallic symbol, an assertion of masculine power and sexual desire. But even subtler movements, like the lip curl symbolizing a mixture of confidence, disdain, and sensuality, the way he held the microphone an extension of his voice and power, or his dramatic bows, a combination of humility and grand theatricality, carried layers of symbolic meaning. Each gesture was a nonverbal message, communicating beyond words, directly to the unconscious. Consider also the stage itself. In Las Vegas, it was a grand, almost theatrical space designed to elevate him to mythical status. The lights, the sound, the band, everything contributed to a symbolic environment where Elvis wasn't just a man, but an archetype, a larger-than-life figure embodying rock and roll, sex, and the American dream. This carefully constructed environment served to amplify the symbolic power of his performance, turning it into a ritualistic experience for his fans. Biographically, Elvis was deeply influenced by gospel music and the spiritual symbolism of his Southern upbringing. His performances of gospel songs were often the most intense and heartfelt, suggesting a deep connection to spiritual symbolism. This spiritual dimension added another layer to his symbolic presence, hinting at a search for meaning and transcendence amidst the commercialism and adulation. What unintended meanings did these symbols convey? Did the weight of these symbols eventually become a burden, trapping him in an image he could not escape? And how much of his eternal appeal comes from the enduring power of these unconscious symbols he so powerfully embodied? Number 4. Did a death drive loom in his fiery performances? Freud's concept of the death drive, or thanatos, is a complex and often debated idea. It refers to an instinctual drive towards destruction, decay, and a return to an inorganic state, existing in tension with the life drive eros. While it's not always overtly visible, one can argue the elements of this destructive energy, this intense drive towards the extreme, were sometimes present in Elvis Presley's fiery performances, particularly as his career progressed and his personal struggles deepened. In his early years, Elvis's performances were characterized by an almost reckless abandon, a wild, untamed energy that seemed to push the boundaries of what was physically possible. He would throw himself into songs, sweating profusely, eyes closed, almost as if he was consuming himself in the act. This intensity, while exhilarating, can also be seen as a form of self-consumption, a burning bright that hinted at an eventual burnout. It was a performance that seemed to flirt with chaos, pushing the performer to the edge of his physical and emotional limits. This wasn't merely vitality, it was a kind of controlled self-destruction in the service of art. As his career wore on, especially into the 1970s, the physical demands of his performances became immense. He often pushed himself despite declining health, drug dependency, and exhaustion. The sheer volume of shows in Las Vegas, the constant touring, the expectation to always deliver a spectacular, high-energy performance, these became a relentless, almost self-punishing cycle. He was literally killing himself on stage, trying to maintain an image and a level of performance that his body and mind could no longer sustain without artificial means. The sweat-soaked jumpsuits, the gasping for breath between songs, the moments of visible fatigue that he wanted them these, were glimpses of the death drive manifesting, a body being pushed beyond its natural limits, and unconscious striving for the ultimate release. Biographically, Elvis often struggled with depression, self-destructive habits, and a profound sense of loneliness. His struggles with prescription drug abuse, documented by Peter Guralnick and others, were a clear manifestation of a self-destructive impulse. When he performed under the influence, his movements could be erratic, his speech slurred, but he still pushed through, often delivering powerful, albeit uneven, performances. This act of performing while physically and mentally compromised, often with a kind of desperate intensity, suggests a drive that goes beyond mere entertainment, a drive to consume himself, to exhaust himself, perhaps even to obliterate the pain through the intensity of the moment. His profound emotional connection to gospel music, particularly its themes of suffering, redemption, and mortality, also hints at an engagement with the death drive. When he sang gospel, his performances were often raw, emotional, and deeply moving, tapping into profound existential angst. This wasn't just about faith, it was about grappling with the big questions of life and death, questions that often resonated with his own internal struggles. The catharsis he found in these songs was perhaps a temporary triumph over the very forces that threatened to consume him. Did the very intensity that made him iconic also contain the seeds of his destruction? Was his relentless pursuit of the ultimate performance an unconscious striving for an ultimate release? And what secrets about our own mortality do we seek to confront or deny when we witness such raw, self-consuming performances? Number 3, how did the audience identify with his every move? Freud's concept of identification is crucial for understanding the profound connection between an audience and a performer like Elvis Presley. An identification occurs when an individual unconsciously adopts the characteristics or qualities of another person. It's a powerful psychological process, particularly strong in group dynamics and hero worship. For millions, watching Elvis was not just passive viewing, it was an act of identification, where they vicariously experienced his rebellious freedom, his raw sexuality, and his charismatic power. In the 1950s, teenagers were seeking their own identity, often in rebellion against their parents' conservative norms. Elvis provided a powerful figure with whom they could identify. His wild hair, his defiant sneer, his sensual movements, these were all markers of a new kind of masculinity and youthful rebellion. For young men, identifying with Elvis meant adopting his cool, confident swagger, his disregard for convention. They tried to copy his hair, his clothes, his attitude. They bought his records, danced like him, and felt empowered by his image. He gave them a blueprint for expressing their own burgeoning desires and frustrations, which society often told them to repress. For young women, the identification was often more complex, sometimes involving projections. They identified with the excitement, the forbidden thrill, the raw emotion he stirred within them. They imagined themselves as the object of his desire, or they felt his emotions with such intensity that it blurred the lines between performer and spectator. The screaming, the fainting, the tears at his concerts were not merely fan hysteria. They were visceral manifestations of this deep identification and unconscious absorption of his energy and emotion. He wasn't just singing to them, he was embodying their own repressed desires for freedom and sensual experience. The psychological mechanism here is that Elvis, through his performance, gave form to feelings and impulses that were often unacknowledged or suppressed in the collective unconscious of his generation. He externalized what was internal, making it acceptable and even desirable to feel these things. This created a powerful feedback loop. He performed, they identified, and their identification fueled his performance even further. Sociologists like T.W. Adorno, while critical of mass culture, noted the overwhelming power of popular figures to elicit such collective responses, even if he viewed them as manipulated. Even later in his career as the king, the identification continued. For older fans, he symbolized nostalgia for a lost youth, a connection to a simpler, more exciting time. They identified with the legend, the larger-than-life figure who had conquered the world. His struggles, too, became part of this identification. Fans empathized with his loneliness, his vulnerabilities, and his attempts to remain relevant. They saw a piece of their own lives and struggles mirrored in his journey. The emotional connection ran so deep that his personal triumphs felt like theirs, and his tragedies like a shared loss. Did this intense identification ultimately trap Elvis, forcing him to forever embody the desires of his audience rather than finding his own path? How much of his later performance was an act of mirroring what his fans expected rather than authentic self-expression? And what deep, unfulfilled needs do we ourselves project onto the figures we idolize most? Number 2, was his stage an arena for the primal scene? Freud's concept of primal scene refers to a child's traumatic or perceived traumatic witnessing of parental intercourse. While literally a specific event, psychoanalytic theory often expands this to encompass any spectacle of forbidden arousal or intensely sexualized content that is witnessed, understood, or fantasized about. For Elvis Presley, his early stage performances can be interpreted as a public, theatrical reenactment of a primal scene, creating a spectacle of forbidden arousal that captivated and shocked millions. In the mid-1950s, American society was deeply puritanical regarding public displays of sexuality. Sex was largely hidden, a private matter, certainly not something for mass consumption, especially by teenagers. And then Elvis arrived. His performances, with their overtly sexual hip movements, his sensual lip curl, his charged voice, and the way he interacted with his guitar and microphone, thrust sexuality directly into the public eye. This wasn't just suggestive, it was visceral. He was presenting a spectacle of raw, untamed sexual energy that society had largely kept repressed and hidden. The audience, especially the throngs of screaming teenage girls, were in a sense witnessing a primal scene. They were being exposed to a level of sexual energy that was usually confined to private fantasies or hushed conversations. The thrill, the shock, the awe, and even the moral outrage he provoked all stem from this unveiling of what was considered forbidden. Parents, seeing their children react so viscerally to Elvis, were effectively witnessing their children's sexual awakening being played out on national television, which could be experienced as a vicarious primal scene, for them too a disturbing exposure to a realm they wished to keep hidden. Consider the atmosphere at his early concerts, the darkness of the venue, the spotlight on Elvis, the frenzied energy of the crowd. It all contributed to an environment that felt secretive, almost illicit. It was a space where normal societal rules seemed suspended. The intensity of his performance, the way he would sweat, the almost animalistic sounds he sometimes made, further amplified this sense of a raw, unmediated act. It was less a structured concert and more an eruption, a release of primal urges. This public unveiling of the body as a site of pleasure and desire in such an uninhibited way directly challenged the societal repression of sexuality. Psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, building on Freud, discussed the gaze and the spectacle. Elvis's performances demanded the gaze, making the audience complicit in the act of witnessing. They couldn't look away, even those who were scandalized. The magnetic pull of the spectacle was too strong. This forced witnessing of overt sexuality, the feeling of being implicated in a forbidden act, imbued his performances with an almost dangerous thrill, an undercurrent of transgression that resonated on a deeply unconscious level. His performance was not just entertainment, it was an experience of boundary breaking, an encounter with the raw, uncensored desires that society kept behind closed doors. Did this early profound connection to the forbidden create an unsustainable standard for Elvis, leading to an unconscious need to constantly push boundaries in his personal life? Did the audience's complicity in this primal scene spectacle leave them with an insatiable hunger for his particular brand of arousal? And how does a society reconcile its public moral outrage with its deep, unconscious craving for such exposed primal displays? Number one, what unknowable truths did his performance unmask? Ultimately, Freudian analysis seeks to unmask hidden truths to bring the unconscious into conscious awareness. When we look at Elvis Presley's stage presence and performance style through these lenses, we are trying to understand the unknowable, or at least the unspoken, dimensions of his artistry and his impact. He was more than a singer. He was a cultural phenomenon, a living embodiment of desires, fears, and conflicts that ran deep within the American psyche. His performance was a mirror, reflecting back to us both the beautiful and unsettling aspects of our own unconscious. He unmasked the raw power of the ID, showing a generation that impulse and desire, while potentially dangerous, were also exhilarating and vital. His early performances, like a psychological excavation, brought forth a collective id, allowing people to feel, move, and express in ways they hadn't before. He showed us that the body, far from being just a vessel, was a source of profound, unsettling power. The very censorship he faced was a testament to the potency of the truths he uncovered, truths about sexual desire and rebellious energy that society preferred to keep buried. His journey, from the raw rebel to the iconic king, unmasked the constant struggle between the id, ego, and superego. We saw the ego's attempts to mediate, to manage the wild impulses against societal demands and internal moral codes. His eventual struggles, his decline, and his tragic death unmasked the immense pressure of maintaining an idealized persona, the toll that constant sublimation and repression can take on an individual. He showed us that even the king was vulnerable, human, and subject to the same internal conflicts that plague us all. His later performances, often tinged with sadness and exhaustion, revealed the heavy cost of living up to a myth, of forever being trapped in a narcissistic echo chamber of adoration. Elvis's stage presence unmasked the powerful, almost ritualistic role of symbolism and identification in mass culture. His costumes, his gestures, his very name became symbols that resonated with profound, often unconscious meaning for millions. He showed us how a performer can become an object of identification, a projection screen for a myriad of desires, hopes, and anxieties. The collective screams of his audience were not just about appreciating a song, they were about a deep, unconscious identification with the freedom and power he represented. He unmasked the collective yearning for a hero, a figure who could articulate and embody our shared, yet often unspoken, desires. Perhaps most profoundly, Elvis's performances, particularly his early ones, unmasked the societal repression of sexuality. By enacting a primal scene on a public stage, he forced a confrontation with forbidden desires. He showed us what happened when the lid was lifted, when the unconscious sexual energy was allowed to surge forth. He brought the uncanny into the living room, showing us that what is familiar can also be deeply unsettling, and that the return of the repressed can be both terrifying and exhilarating. He pulled back the curtain on the things we thought we knew about ourselves and our society, revealing the darker, more primitive energies lurking beneath the surface. What deep, unspoken anxieties about our own sexuality and mortality did Elvis's performances tap into, anxieties that still resonate today? Why are we still so drawn to figures who embody contradictions and reveal the raw, untamed aspects of humanity? And what profound, unsettling truths about our collective unconscious do we continue to repress, even as we idolize those who dared to unmask them?